It does not escape me that the only thing between lunch and you is me. So I will make this quite succinct, and I'll move through it pretty quickly. I do appreciate Northeast DAS, Alyssa, for letting us have the opportunity to speak about the Edge. So I'm going to just step back for a second and marvel for a second here, because I've been listening to people, and you'll see some themes in what I have to say that was discussed earlier today. But if you think about the phenomenal pace at which the whole network, the telecommunications network, is changing, it's really astounding. To think about 100 years that went by that Ma Bell and a little place called Bell Labs created this infrastructure that cost hundreds of millions of dollars is disappearing before our very eyes. It's absolutely phenomenal to me to watch this happen. So what we talk about at EdgeConnex is really the edge, and this has been discussed. I think it's important to look at a couple of things, really, in terms of data. You can see up here, Pittsburgh in 2019 will use as much traffic as DC, or excuse me, 2019 as DC did in 2014. Dayton, Ohio, as much as Boston. And if you look over at New York City, Denver, of all places, in a couple of years will be using as much as New York City. It's absolutely amazing how fast the data is being consumed by consumers. So at EdgeConnex, as been described earlier, what's changing out there in the ecosystem is content, and that's different than, for those of you that have been in wireless for a long time, as I have. You didn't worry too much about that. Peering networks, there used to be one north or east and west, May East, May West, and then there were several regional ones. Well, that game is changing. EdgeConnex is participating in that, where you now have local peering locations, call them local neighborhood data centers where all this stuff resides. And as a company, we've only been around for about 6 years. We're probably the most aggressive when it comes to building these data centers. We've got a couple of dozen already and moving internationally in Europe as we speak. But if you look at how that's evolved, you go then to the eyeball networks, whether it's a wireline, usually through cable, although the phone companies are doing it as well as mobile. And it delivers what the customer wants, cloud DVR, 4K video, Internet of Things, content anywhere they want it. It's amazing to me, even one of the carriers, the wireless carriers, came out with a data-only plan just recently, which means no voice, and that's what the millennials will be demanding. So it's breathtaking how quick this is happening. So if you look at the networks themselves, I'll focus on 3 areas: wireless coverage and capacity. It's our view that the edge then, as has been described many times this morning, is small cells and Wi-Fi. I think that you'll see continuing densification, which has been talked about. I think the challenge for DAS networks as well as small cell will be pressure on cost. That will be a significant issue, which I'll talk about here in just a second. In terms of backhaul, nothing new there that hasn't already been said. Optimizing dark fiber, some lit fiber, combination of both using metro rings. That's where the value is being created in the backhaul business and where the money is, frankly. In terms of content transport, I mentioned that earlier. It used to be sort of regional peering locations. Now you're going to see it in neighborhoods. It wouldn't surprise me 10 years from now. New York's a little bit different because you have the big, huge data centers here, but in other communities throughout the country, there will be more than just one data center in a particular city because of the way it works. And for those that don't really understand how this plays out for you as a consumer, the illustration I like to use is if you're a Netflix user, and by the way, video's driving all of this, and you like House of Cards, and that's your episode, hypothetically, you would ping Dallas and then Los Gatos and then come back to your house, wherever that might be in the country. The problem with that is you go through all this backhaul. It costs the carriers a lot of money. and latency is not very good. You get the spinning wheel. So by putting this content at the edge, it reduces all that backhaul, so the network guys are pretty happy because they reduce cost. The consumer's also happy because latency's reduced, and the experience for the consumer is better. So unfortunately, they know which episode you're going to watch, and they know when you're going to watch it, and so that's then, instead of going all the way to Los Gatos, it goes to your neighborhood and back out to you on whatever device that you happen to be using. So here are a few of the places you're going to see the edge over the next 5 years or so. And you know, I might add that this is moving so quickly that it wouldn't surprise me that some of this may change as well. Edge data centers I've mentioned, where the content then resides with the network provider, whether that's wireline, cable, or wireless, and then the content providers. And you know, if you're in wireless, you didn't really think too much about Facebook or Twitch or Google. Those people are going to be major providers going forward in the new world. I call these micro data centers. We're talking sort of about what's been discussed earlier today, the CRAN locations where you're going to not only aggregate backhaul, but aggregate RF. There will be some content that resides there. How much actually is still under debate. But I think you will see some of that happen just for the same reasons we talked about the edge being important. And then at the far right is edge pops. We call those edge pops. They're really fiber demarcation locations and small cells. You know, here in New York, it's interesting because the real estate owners have demanded, I'll call it extortion pricing, to demarc fiber into their facilities because they felt like, hey, I've got my building. You need service in here? Well, you're going to pay me for it. That's beginning to shift, and so is the need to provide wireless. And I think you all know exactly what I'm talking about. I think over the rest of the country, you're seeing less and less of the, or at least a change where the property owner now is recognizing, I've got to provide this utility. Why would I disincent somebody from coming to my building? And so I think you'll see that shift as well. So I want to just quickly, as I sort of wrap up here, talk about some of the common challenges that we're going to see in each of the areas that I mentioned. And it turns out there are a lot of challenges that we have in this infrastructure business, but there are 3 or 4 that I think were important to kind of talk about that have commonality amongst them all. So if you look at edge data centers and you look at the challenges there in the middle, it turns out that you don't want to build these edge data centers where you don't have fiber. And I don't mean just one provider, I mean multiple providers. The more providers you can get into a data center, the happier the content people are going to be, because then they can leverage their own buying power to price down the backhaul. So that's really important. So in other words, when you decide where you're going to put an edge data center, that becomes number one. Where's the fiber at, so that you don't have to pay a lot of money to get that fiber to your data center. Second, neutrality. It's important that a network provider does not own that facility, because it then inhibits the content provider from coming in. Exactly the same reason why the carrier owns DAS and the other carriers don't particularly like to be part of that DAS because it's owned by a competitor. It's a problem. Now that happens today, of course, but I think that creates issues, particularly when things go wrong. Because the wireless carriers are not made to be neutral host providers. That's just not in their DNA. You come down to economics. It's no different than the challenges on DAS. You've got to put these data centers in locations that are inexpensive, because the content guys now have to put their caching servers in multiple locations, and that becomes expensive. So space and power becomes really important from an economic standpoint in getting the best deal you can get. And then lastly, location. That's anything in real estate is location, location, location. So that's data centers. If you go down to fiber demarcation, I alluded to this, we call them EPOPs. The more fiber you can get into the building, the better that building is. And I do think there will be pressure coming on the building owners that have forced fiber providers to pay, that they'll be more interested now to get multiple providers into their buildings. It'll be a little more difficult here in New York because of the amount of time and energy that's gone into that effort over the last 10 to 15 years. But I do think that that is situation that you'll see nationwide. So in terms of the buildings, they want, if I'm a building owner, I want multiple providers into that building. I want neutrality so that one particular fiber provider doesn't own the demarc, thereby discouraging others from joining. I want to make sure that I provide space and power economically so that it's inexpensive to provide that backhaul. And of course, I want that fiber in the best buildings that I can put it in. Same holds true for what we call edge data centers, the CRAN locations. Again, you want to be in a place where there's lots of fiber, and not just one provider, but many. You want neutrality, because that's what the content and the network guys are going to demand over time. It has to be inexpensive, and that was alluded to on a couple of panels here earlier. And then, of course, location's important, because you can't put these too far away from where they need to serve. Then lastly, we come down to both outdoor DAS and indoor DAS and small cells. This has been an area that's been very interesting to watch over the last couple of years. As you know, a lot of hoopla, not much real action until really recently. Most of that activity has happened outdoors as opposed to indoors. And there are particular companies that are focusing on that. But the same holds true. You don't want to provide a head end where you don't have a lot of fiber options to that. You want to have neutrality, and I'm sure some of the carriers, if they're in this room, would object to what I'm saying. But I do believe that it's inherent in their DNA that it's difficult for them to both own a DAS and operate a DAS with their competitors. The problem is, at least in the DAS world, the typical owners of these have been the tower companies, and oftentimes they don't get along. And there seems to be angst, to put it lightly, between the two. So I think the challenge going forward, since DAS is not necessarily monopoly like a tower is, you have to have some customer satisfaction supporting those infrastructure players, and that will be a shift that occurs. I mentioned neutrality. Economics is also important. I'm not I do believe DAS will have a place in this ecosystem going forward. In fact, one of the previous companies I was with, we built the first outdoor DAS in the country out on the little island of Nantucket back in '04. So I do think that there's a need for DAS going forward, but there will be extensive pressure on cost because, as discussed earlier, the carriers don't have the money like they used to. They just don't have it. And the amount of data that's this tsunami that's rolling over them, they can't afford to solve the problems in a voice-centric system like they used to. Those days are gone and evaporating quickly. So economics will continue to be a pressure point going forward. And then, of course, location. You want to put these in the right places. And in terms of indoor, that's an interesting area, at least for me personally, because I think there's a huge opportunity. It won't be driven by the carriers, however. They need to participate. Wi-Fi will play a part. 3.5 will play a part. A lot of different places or different portions of the ecosystem will go into creating the indoor opportunity. But it does require, I think, a neutral host, similar to what you see with the challenges. You want to put an indoor solution where you got lots of fiber. There's a kind of a dirty secret out there in the fiber world, which you won't hear much, and that's called price compression. So they're seeing price reductions really every year. And that's demonstrated in the amount of bandwidth that is developing, not necessarily in how much they're receiving in revenue. However, from a pure cost per megabit, it's been going down really quite a bit over the last 5 years and will continue to do so. So indoors, you know, you'll see a number of things that will happen. You'll see small cells. I think mostly you'll see that more opposed to that than DAS just because of the cost. But you'll see neutral small cells. And it's interesting that the small cell world hasn't really developed because none of the OEMs have built a true small cell indoor solution. That will happen over time. And you will see that probably this year would be my guess. You'll also see people out there putting repeaters in. So if you're a property owner and you cannot afford the price tag, but you want to fix the problem because that millennial walks in and says, I'm not going to rent your particular facility because I can't get my phone to work, you will see some repeater use being exercised. And that's somewhat of a Band-Aid, but those repeater systems, I think, can be gravitated into from a more passive type DAS to an active DAS or small cell solution. So I think what you'll see in the small cell world is a continuing change in the real estate of property owners from, that's your problem, wireless carrier, I call you, and by the way, I'm going to charge you, to, oh, now I got to pay for it, and who am I going to get to do that? Because my guy knows IT, maybe, but they don't know wireless. And so I think therein lies the opportunity. And you're seeing that shift even here in New York, a little bit slower. You're seeing that shift certainly in other cities throughout the country. Just to give you an example, it wasn't more than 2.5 years ago, we were looking at a small cell. This happened to be outdoor, but in a venue where you saw retail, commercial, and residential all together. And at that time, the property owner said, yeah, sure, come on in. I'm going to charge you $400 a node, and you can have all you want. And we said, no, it doesn't work that way. We're not going to give you anything, and by the way, you should be begging us because your tenants are going to leave if they don't have better coverage. That shift from that point 2.5 years ago to now recognizing, oh yeah, I guess I don't really need that $400 a node, is something that's happening again across the country. And that's a shift that I think all of you will begin to see more and more, even in New York. So in summary, it's exciting. It's a fun time. I love to be part of shaping the future. I hope you do too. And hopefully if we do this right and we find the right business models, there will be money to be made. Thank you very much.